Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to our webinar on human trafficking and Indigenous women and girls. Where are we and what are we doing? Which is hosted by METRAC. My name is Andrea Collins Fitzpatrick, and I am the Legal Director for METRAC's Community Justice Program. I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Although we may all be located in different places right now, I will acknowledge the territory in which METRAC is physically located. We acknowledge that this land is traditional territory of many nations, including the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still home to many Indigenous people. We honor all the First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people living on this land. We recognize the traditional territories on which our organization is located and on which our programs and trainings take place. I would like to remind you that this webinar is for general information purposes only and is not legal advice. The legal information provided is not intended to be used as legal advice for a specific legal problem. I would also like to remind you that this webinar will be recorded and will be posted on our website at onefamilylaw.ca. I would also like to remind you that we will have a Q&A after the presentation. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat. We also have a survey that we would please like you to fill out. It will be posted in the chat towards the end of the presentation. Before I move on to our presenters today, I would like to tell you a bit about METRAC. METRAC works to end gender-based violence across communities through education, research, and policies. We have been in existence since 1984, and our programs are devoted to advancing safety, justice, and equity. METRAC's Community Justice Program provides legal education and information related to gender-based violence. Through our public legal education program, we provide legal information in areas of family law, immigration law, criminal law, employment law, and human rights law. This webinar is part of our FLU, Family Law Education for Women series. FLU's resources are available in 14 languages, ASL videos, and accessible formats. You can visit our website at onefamilylaw.ca for more information related to family law matters. I'm delighted this afternoon to have Seneca Longclaws and Stephen Hunter to speak to us today. Seneca Longclaws is the president and senior lawyer of Badome and Longclaws Law Corporation. She graduated from the Faculty of Law at the University of Manitoba in 2008 and received her call to the bar in 2009. Seneca's practice has included working in not-for-profit organizations, solo practices, mid-sized firms, and recently as partner in a law corporation. She is focused on serving First Nation governments, tribal organizations, Indigenous peoples, and self-represented and unrepresented litigants. Seneca has extensive experience in a broad variety of areas of law, including Aboriginal law, Indigenous law, corporate law, business and organizational development, employment law, residential abuse claims, wills and estates, family law, and criminal matters. She has taught law and social work students through the Legal Help Center, as well as legal assistance through Red River College. Seneca grew up in Winnipeg and is a proud member of the Weiwei-Sikapo First Nation. She's also a mother of two. Stephen Hunter is a proud member of the Kichi-Wachi-Naung First Nation, and I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce that correctly, Steve. The non-traditional name in the community is Dauphin River First Nation. He spent his early years living in the surrounding community and then moved to the POW, where he completed middle and high school. Shortly after graduation, he moved to Winnipeg, and he started family and his educational journey at University of Manitoba in 2005. By 2013, he'd obtained an advanced four-year degree in economics with a minor in philosophy, and he had also obtained his Juris Doctor degree. He completed his articling period in Brandon, Manitoba. Then he moved back to Winnipeg so that he could be closer to his family. He began working for the Badome and Longclaws Law Corporation prior to the firm's incorporation. He has been practicing law with that firm since November of 2017. His areas of work are mostly exclusively in child protection and civil litigation. Thank you so much, Seneca and Stephen. We're privileged to have you here today, and I'll now pass things over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Andrea. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Seneca. I'm very happy to be here today to be able to present this webinar to everyone that is here today. And as well, my partner, my associate, Stephen Hunter, we are doing the presentation together. And so he's in another room here in the office, and we were able to figure out some technical difficulties. So I'm just glad that everyone was able to hold on for a few minutes before we started. Our office is located in Swan Lake First Nation, which is in Headingley, Manitoba, which is just outside of Winnipeg. And Swan Lake is part of Treaty 1. So I would like to provide that land acknowledgement as well. And they are Reserve 8A in our community. To begin today, I would like to just provide a little bit of an introduction as how we came to start working with Metric and how this webinar came about. So it was about late 2021 when Metric contacted our offices and had asked if we would be interested in developing a partnership with them in order to create a legal resource that would provide legal information to Indigenous women and girls that were at risk of or had been trafficked and sexually exploited. The project involved legal research as well as literature reviews, the drafting of the booklet. As well, I conducted several consultations with providers in this area, and as well as victims and survivors of trafficking and sexual exploitation. As well, the art that was prepared for the booklet was done by a very talented, wonderful Indigenous artist from here in Manitoba. This booklet is being used in Ontario and Manitoba. And as well, it is available on Metric's website, which I know will be shared with everyone following the presentation. We were asked to develop this webinar, present it, to discuss the booklets, the information that we learned, as well as some of the resources that we had found. And we had decided as well to discuss the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, and how that also has been tied into what we're seeing now with a lot of these cases of human trafficking, sexual exploitation, violence as well. So today, the topics to be covered will be, first, we will talk about MMIWG and how this movement has brought awareness. However, this issue continues. We will then talk as well, why does this issue continue? What are some of the reasons? What has been happening? What changes maybe have occurred, but what still are some of the things that should be addressed. We will also talk about human trafficking and sexual exploitation. What does this mean? What is available in law to address these terrible tragedies? Then we will talk about why are Indigenous women and girls victims of human trafficking and sexual exploitation at rates that we see are much more higher than non-Indigenous women and girls. Why might this be happening? As well, what can we do to address these issues? And where can people go for help? So MMIWG, I'm not sure if many people are aware that are listening in today. This was a national inquiry that took place to look into and report on all forms of violence against Indigenous women and girls. It also looked at the systematic causes of these forms of violence, including sexual violence. It also looked at why are Indigenous women and girls vulnerable to violence? What are the underlying issues that causes this? And what was found that there were many different causes related to the social, economic, cultural, institutional, and historical causes that contribute to violence and vulnerability of our Indigenous women and girls. The report, they reviewed and examined existing policies and practices that are in place to address violence and to reduce violence and to increase safety. In this report, they also looked at what might be some of the issues that need to be addressed so that what is out there and available can be more helpful, as well as what can be changed. The mandate was broad, so it could include all forms of violence. It wasn't just meant to address those that have gone missing or have been murdered. As well, they set up hearings throughout the country where families, survivors, could come forward and share their stories, what happened to their family members, what happened to their self, what were their personal stories as well, so that there could be a better understanding of what has occurred and what can be done to help. Some of the issues that were brought forward, stories that were told, talked about sexual assault that the women had went through, child abuse, domestic violence, bullying, harassment, suicide, and self-harm were just some of what was listed. As well, many of these women and girls and their families talked about how they had been devalued, that their place as women, as girls, as caregivers, which in our cultural tradition has always been what the role of women bring amongst many other roles that they bring, and how that role has been devalued and ignored. That also found that there are many stereotypes that are still existing to this day and that continue to be driven by colonialism, racism, and misogyny. The report found that attitudes and understandings, they need to change in order for any change to happen. As well, because survivors had their opportunity to tell their truths, there was some healing that took place during this process. And as a result of all of these hearings, the reports, the studies, all those that came together to work on this issue, it was shared with the general society through this report and through different educational programs that have now become available. It did create an awareness that many people did not know about what was happening and why this was happening. However, we are seeing that this violence continues still to this day. They also found that the solutions that are to be designed to help our Indigenous women and girls, they should be designed to be culturally appropriate, which many of these services and programs are not. As well, that there needs to be more respect for our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, as all of the cultures are distinct. Their way of lives are different, their languages are different, their traditions are different. All of the communities have their own political, legal, social, cultural, and economic systems that have been in place since the time immemorial. And so this is an issue that we thought would be important to discuss and kind of to introduce what we're speaking about today in terms of what we found through our research, what we created in this booklet, and what we're hoping that we can do and work together as a community with everyone to try to address and help our Indigenous women and girls. And now Steve is going to talk a little bit about some of these cases that have occurred over the many years.
There we go. The topic I want to discuss, I guess, really briefly, is Trafficking, and that was one of the most egregious that we're aware of. Between 1978 and 2001, at least 65 women disappeared from the down and east side city of Vancouver. Robert Picton operated a pig farm in Port Coquitlam and was eventually charged with the murder of 26 women. He was convicted of 6 of the murders. Mr. Picton claimed to have murdered 49 women over the years. The BC provincial government in 2012 did an inquiry into that case and concluded that there was failures by the police that were in their investigation. This included inept criminal investigative work, police and societal prejudice against Indigenous women, and sex trade workers, which were his targets. This was one of the more egregious ones that racism really came into the spotlight with respect to these circumstances. I'd like to take a look at Fort Frances, Ontario. Fort Frances is a border town which is across the International Falls Bridge in the United States. A number of women and girls dependent on drugs who are vulnerable in this area. With respect to addiction and homelessness, there is a connection there between that, and these predators are feeding off the trauma that these women and girls have experienced. And so these women and girls are doing whatever it takes to get their fix and are vulnerable to being trafficked to obtain the drugs that they are addicted to. Moving on, I guess, is the next example. It's more local to us, I suppose, that being the situation with Jeremy Skibicki, who was a serial killer here in Winnipeg. Jeremy Skibicki was charged with threatening to kill two previous years. He charged with assaulting both of the women. However, one of the charges was stayed. This allowed him to remain going out on the streets until December of 2022, when he was charged with murder of 4 women, 3 of them were First Nation and 1 identified as Indigenous. Going through his social media, police were able to link him to violent sentiments, anti-Semitic and misogynistic and white supremacist materials. Remains of one of the victims were found at the Brady landfill, which is north of Winnipeg. Public outcry for a search at the landfill, however, is yet to happen. There's much debate within the city of Winnipeg as to whether that should be undertaken or not. Last I heard on this one, there was a protest of the Brady landfill where they had it closed. And then moving south of the border, there's the situation in South Dakota, which was about bringing on social media, but it hasn't really been given a lot of airtime. So earlier this year, between January 1st and January 26th, there were 26 South Dakotans that have been reported missing. 4 of those individuals have traditional Native American names, and authorities are urging the public to report missing persons as soon as they are going missing. Contrary to what you see on TV, there is no requirement that a person needs to be missing for a specific amount of time in order for them to be reported as missing. And I'd like to add that the current 135 persons that are reported in total in South Dakota, 80 of them are Native American. So moving on to the next slide. So why does this continue? We had this report that came out. There were a number of interviews. People told their stories. Quite frankly, this needs to be a larger societal concern. However, it has been rather convenient to ignore by mainstream Canada. We found that colonialism, racism, stereotyping, very little awareness and education, a lesser value placed on Indigenous women and girls by society, negative beliefs and attitudes have persisted to allow this to keep occurring. Past and present cases have been ignored. There's little resources that are put into assist in solving these cases, and there's not enough pressure from Canadian society to solve these cases or to pursue them. 5% of the Canadian population is Indigenous. As such, happening to the non-Indigenous society at these rates, how can Indigenous people address this issue on their own? So the next slide looks at what is human trafficking. The sanitized definition provides that human trafficking is a crime where a person is controlled and exploited for the benefit of someone else. It involves activities such as recruiting people, moving them from one place to another, or keeping them in a secret place for the purpose of exploiting them. These traffickers use different tactics such as force, threats, manipulation, blackmailing, etc., to force these victims/survivors to do things against their will, such as provide their labor or sexual services, marry someone they don't marry, removal and sale of the organs. Traffickers can be one individual or they can be part of a larger criminal network. This was the definition provided from Metric with their Action on Violence campaign. Now, under international law, there's a similar definition of human trafficking. Trafficking in persons shall mean the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power or a position of vulnerability, or of the giving and receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. This exploitation shall include, at a minimum, the exploitation of the prostitution of others or other forms of sexual exploitation, forced labor or services, slavery, or practice of slavery, servitude, or the removal of organs. That is, the actions carried out by a specific means for a specific purpose. So what is sexual exploitation? Sexual exploitation refers to coercing or deceiving someone to have sex or perform sexual acts for something of value. That can be money, food, drugs, alcohol, transportation, etc. We urge everyone to speak out and stop sex trafficking. So, the Protecting Canadians from Online Crime Act makes it illegal to publish, distribute, transmit, sell, make available, or advertise an intimate image of a person, knowing that the person depicted in the image did not give their consent to that conduct. Online luring is a term used to describe when someone communicates with a child online for sexual purposes. Sextortion is a term used to describe when someone coerces youth into sending sexual images or engaging in sexual acts via camera-enabled devices, and then blackmailing them with the threat of distributing the sexual images if they do not pay money or provide sexual images or videos. This was provided from the Canadian Centre for Child Protection in their report regarding emerging issues protecting kidsonline.ca. So the criminal code deals with human trafficking as well. Under human trafficking, the criminal code makes it illegal to underage people for trafficking purposes, to traffic in persons, to receive any material benefits from human trafficking, withholding or destroying documents for the purpose of trafficking. All of these actions where it concerns underage persons and imposes mandatory minimum sentences for doing those things. Unfortunately, those mandatory minimum sentences have been held as being unconstitutional. And that was in the recent case of R.V. John from January 9th, 2020, from the Ontario Superior Court. What the courts have done since that was found to be unconstitutional is largely leaving it up to the judge to come up with a fit sentence now that they don't have that mandatory minimum to rely upon. So jumping back to the criminal code and the human trafficking. So the Canadian Criminal Code deals with crimes committed within Canadian borders. So with respect to human trafficking, the statute's been amended to allow for the prosecution of Canadian citizens and permanent residents of human trafficking committed in other countries. So it does extend the reach of the law in that aspect. Again, it makes it illegal to communicate with underage people, trafficking, and to receive any material benefits from the human trafficking. And moving on to the next slide real quick here. Just want to point out that it is legal for someone to lure a child for the purpose of human trafficking. It's illegal to human traffic. It's illegal to receive a material benefit from human trafficking. It's illegal for a person to withhold crucial documents to get a person to comply. There is the legal definition of exploitation for the purposes of defining these activities. It's illegal to do any of these things to children. It's illegal for Canadian citizens and permanent residents to do these in other countries. And unfortunately, there are no longer mandatory minimum sentences that have been found to be constitutional with respect to these crimes. Turn it back over to Seneca.
Hi, thanks, Steve. I apologize. I think we may be cutting out a little bit here and there. Technology, I'm just not sure. We thought we had the issues worked out, but I apologize. And I do hope that people are being able to hear us. And so Steve just went over the law with respect to human trafficking and sexual exploitation here in Canada and the definitions of both those crimes. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the targets of human trafficking. It's definitely young women and girls that this is happening to at higher rates than men and boys, as well Indigenous women and girls in particular, we're seeing at higher rates, and which is the purpose of this webinar today, to talk a little bit about that, and was the purpose of us creating the booklet as well. LGBTQA2S plus youth, they are also targets of human trafficking at higher rates. Homeless youth, so those youth that are living on the streets, as well as when I had done these consultations with different victims and survivors and the service providers, that there are a lot of males, men and boys that are being exploited and trafficked as well. And unfortunately, there isn't very many services available for them. And as well, like, it isn't really an issue that's being talked about as much. it's almost never reported. So there were a lot of things that I found out by talking to those that are going through it, that those that have went through it. We'll talk a little bit about that later, but often these cases are unreported and are not discussed. There's little resources, awareness, and information out there. And so a lot of times the general population doesn't know that this is occurring. And so why are Indigenous women experiencing this at a higher rate? There are many different reasons, and this is just a list of some of what we found in our research, as well as what is known, and as well as what we learned through our consultations. So colonization, loss of traditional lands, language, culture, as well residential schools. Children were taken from their homes and raised in schools where, again, they were not allowed to practice their culture, speak their language. Many of them suffered physical and sexual abuse. The 60s scoop. So this was a time when Indigenous children, they were taken from their homes and adopted out into non-Indigenous homes across the country, as well as in the United States. And it was also a time when many of the children were also placed in foster homes to be raised in city centers where they experienced cultural shock, as well as some of the other things that I spoke of, such as not being able to practice their culture, not being with their family, not being able to speak their language, being taught an education that was very new to them. Intergenerational trauma. Myself, I am, my family has been to residential schools, day schools, has been through 60s scoop. And so it was very difficult to be able to parent once the children came back from school or went on to become adults themselves due to everything that they experienced and the love that they did not receive, the things that they did not learn that you would in a loving, caring home. And so it did impact then the families that they raised. And so that's known as intergenerational trauma, and it continues generation to generation. In our culture, we say often that the next 7 generations after will be affected. And domestic violence, drug and alcohol issues. So we see a lot of addiction, and that's being used actually as a form of control in order to traffic and exploit Indigenous women and girls. Abuse, both sexual and physical, verbal, emotional, psychological, poverty. Many of the victims and survivors were homeless, low income, as well as gender inequity. And so again, women and girls are, especially Indigenous ones, we found have been devalued. Their role as caregivers and life givers and matriarchs, they're no longer seen or viewed as who they are. Discrimination, racism, and a lack of opportunities. So often these Indigenous women and girls are growing up in communities or homes, places where there are no opportunities. It's very hard in order to be successful in mainstream society's systems of education, etc. One of the big things we found in our research and this work was that the child and family services systems has really created a lot of issues and problems for our people. It's been now seen as the modern day residential school. What it has created in a lot of families is a breakdown. Families are split up, siblings are split up, they're placed in, again, foster homes, boarding schools. They turn to the streets to get away from these homes that are supposed to be safe but are not safe. As a result, they're also, again, then being raised away from their families and their culture. And that creates a vulnerability when you don't have that connection. And that was one of the biggest things that I learned from those victims and survivors was almost all of them were in CFS prior to becoming victims of trafficking and exploitation. So again, some of the other reasons that create such a vulnerability or lead to Indigenous women and girls being trafficked and exploited is low self-esteem. That was something I heard over and over again, that children and as youths, they were raised in environments where they were not valued, they were not loved, they didn't have any connection to those that they were being raised by. if it was in CFS or other homes, and even in their own families, as often their families were struggling from things such as 60 scoop, residential schools, everything that I listed just earlier. And when you don't have self-esteem, or your self-esteem is low, then you don't feel like you have any value. And so you don't feel like you deserve anything different, and that you can be trafficked and exploited because you mean nothing. Again, CFS, and which I just talked a bit about. What I also heard from a lot of people was that they wanted to feel accepted, these women, these girls. They wanted loved. They wanted to feel like they belonged, that they could believe in themselves. And they got this feeling from the sex trade and the streets. They would work with other sex trade workers, and they would support one another and feel like they were a family. They felt like they had some sort of value from their traffickers, their exploiters, because they felt that that was the only value they could give, and they were finally getting something. As well, even some of them spoke as the perpetrators that would sell their services to, their sexual services to, and other things, also gave them some sort of feeling of belonging. Being unaware, so often you don't realize that you're in this situation. You often feel like, the trafficker, the exploiter, they're my boyfriend, they're my partner, they love me, they rescued me from something that was even worse. They felt like they had control now, that they could actually, do something, provide something for themselves. Survival, often these women and girls, they needed to do this in order just to survive. They needed somewhere to live. They needed food. They needed money. They needed drugs or alcohol for their addictions. And so often this was why they were doing this. And a term that it was often used is survival sex. Trauma and mental health. So when you're suffering through trauma, things that may have happened to them as children or youth, or within their families or their communities that they have been affected by and suffered trauma from, or mental health issues. A lot of times people would turn to addictions to cope with their pain, just so that they didn't have to feel it anymore, so they could be numb, so they could try to forget for a little bit. And then this would make them vulnerable as well and at risk. Addictions, often these traffickers and these exploiters, they supply them with what they need, and they will keep doing what they have to, these women and girls, in order to have access to those drugs and alcohols. And the traffickers and the exploiters, they know this, and that's why they do it. The internet is a big thing now. Sexual exploitation is occurring online at high rates, and it's very hard to be able to know that this is happening, to be able to prosecute somebody that is doing this, because often it's easy to just shut down a web page or pretend you're somebody else, and then just pick it up somewhere on another web page or something. It's and you never know where these people are coming from as well either. And it's very easy to access the internet and that in many places. And so this is an easy means of being able to exploit and traffic. And absolutely, I just see this comment as well. Yes, the traffickers and the exploiters, they will get women and girls addicted purposely to drugs and alcohol against their own will. They will hold them. They will force them to do things. And that's been happening as well for a very long time. With the internet then as well, it's very easy to then, if you're in Winnipeg, connect with somebody in Vancouver. Next thing you know, you're on a bus and you're gone and nobody knows where you went.
As previously touched upon, the Canadian Criminal Code does deal with this issue specifically. The provinces have also enacted their own laws to assist with prosecutions, to assist with helping the victims. And I'll return to that briefly. I just wanted to go through some statistics that we were able to uncover with respect to human trafficking here. Moving on to the next slide here, if you could. So we found that Canada is a source, transit, and destination country for human trafficking. Human trafficking is one of those things that's difficult to accurately measure due to the fact that it goes unreported more often than not, goes unpunished. It's also a crime that's not prosecuted as often as other crimes. We're unsure why that is, but moving on to the next slide here, we note that under the 2019 Stats Canada report, 95% of trafficked people were women. Women under the age of 25 represented 70% of all those cases. They found that Indigenous women and girls were more affected. I'd like to look back at one of the things that I previously discussed that I neglected to mention, the Jeremy Skibicki situation here in Winnipeg. I'd like to mention that the homeless shelters in Winnipeg was where he found his victims. And as well, I'd like to add with respect to what Seneca said with respect to children in care, I'd like to point out that in Manitoba, 9% of the 10,000 kids who were in care last year were Indigenous. So that also would indicate that Indigenous children are more affected by this. But moving on to the next slide here. So where is this happening? We found that Ontario accounted for 66% of all human trafficking incidents that were reported 2009 and 2019 in that 10-year span there. Again, I'm sure there's a lot more incidents that went unreported. The majority of these were reported by police in urban centers. 85% of these human trafficking incidents in 2019 were in large cities with populations of 100,000 or more. There's a higher number of human trafficking incidents in large cities, partly attributable to the higher demand for sexual services that's to be found in those urban areas. Move on to the next slide here. Not all trafficking is done for sexual exploitation. There is a component of human trafficking that's to do with forced labor. Some of the victims of this forced labor, human trafficking, can be found in domestic caregiving, sweatshop factories, construction, farming or landscaping, fisheries, hotel or tourism industries, panhandling, janitorial services, and restaurant services. Human trafficking can occur whenever the demand for these services exists. The demand for this labor or sexual exploitation, which is largely driving human trafficking. Moving on to the next slide here. As Seneca pointed out, there is a connection between people coming out of provincial CFS care and those who are trafficked. It's found that these kids oftentimes don't have a connection with a family or with anybody really. So anyone who has this disconnect was certainly more vulnerable to being trafficked or amenable to being trafficked. So again, this is exacerbated by the current CFS system being reactive to human trafficking rather than proactive to the problem. Substance abuse treatment opportunities are in high demand with a short supply as well. So that ties into the addictions component of human trafficking. And in the age of further reliance on technology, it's been found that online activities are creating some difficulty in tracking human trafficking with respect to victims and perpetrators. Turn it back over to Sam.
Okay, so now that we've talked a bit about, why and how come, and now what are some of the things that can be done? So we found awareness is one big thing. As I spoke to earlier, a lot of the general society here in Canada, they don't know necessarily that this is happening, or they don't know it's at the rates that it is happening. It's also easy to ignore when it's not happening to non-Indigenous women and girls at the rate it is happening to Indigenous women and girls, often because of all of the things we talked about earlier, such as stereotypes, etc. It's just people are just not aware or not paying attention. It is good to talk about it, make people aware. I really have to thank those victims and survivors that spoke to me about all of this. As well, educating people about what trafficking is, what sexual exploitation is. It can help for more of an understanding on this issue. Education provides awareness as well, and it can be a way to try to help stop or address what's happening, because the better people can understand why, how, what can we do, the better then people can try to help. There are programs and services that are available where people can turn to for support and safety. What I did find was that there's never enough services, is what I have found in my work all these years in social work and now in law. And it's particular for those that are being trafficked and exploited. The need for safety is a huge thing. And it's very hard to feel safe in these homes because still the perpetrators, the exploiters, the traffickers, they know where these safe homes are. It's very hard to keep them hidden. They often lure the women and girls back out of there using all of the things that we talked about earlier in order to control them, because there aren't as many services available in order to meet the need. Often women and girls are sent to other cities, especially when I had spoken to people that were in Northwestern Ontario, outside the Greater Toronto area, in communities here in Manitoba, that they have to be sent to the city somewhere. Could be Winnipeg, it could be Toronto, in order just to have these services. And then these women and girls are alone. They have no family. They don't know anyone out there. It's very hard for them to have the support that they need to get through this. And as well, sometimes once they have gone to a larger city center, then they become even more at risk or vulnerable to traffickers and exploiters, as often as Steve was just talking about. The larger city centers, there's more of a demand for these services, forced labor and sexual services, that then they become vulnerable to getting back into, unfortunately. However, the more programs and services that are available, the more then these women and girls will have somewhere to go, somewhere for help and somewhere to be safe. Also, through a lot of the research that we did, laws need to be changed in order for the perpetrators, the traffickers, the exploiters to be charged and convicted. Often it's very hard to charge the offenders, as well, very hard to convict. As I'm sure we know working in this field, that it's very hard for a victim to come forward and be able to speak about what happened. They're scared. Often they don't trust the police. I was told that there are a lot of police officers that will go and bribe these women and girls and say, hey, what you're doing is illegal, so you need to do this in order for you not to get in trouble. And they don't trust the police. As well, going to trial, that's a long process. It's not easy for the victim at all. They are expected to testify. They are expected to stay involved in this process for, 2, 3, few years before anything happens. And the rate at which convictions occur is extremely low. I know we had some statistics on that earlier. Unfortunately, it didn't make the presentation. I apologize for that. It's very, very hard. What we have seen in order for the offender to be held accountable. As well, there are so many elements of the crime that have to be proven. And so often that's also another issue, because the victims won't come forward, or the offenders will, have different reasons why A, B, and C. And so therefore the elements of the crime are not proved. And then the Crown is not able to have enough evidence to convict. And those are just some of the issues with our legal system, unfortunately. And as Steve had just spoken to earlier as well, there was mandatory minimum sentences in place if someone was charged and convicted of human trafficking. And now that was found to be unconstitutional, and the courts are trying to base it on a case-by-case basis, what's appropriate for the sentence. However, I'm not so sure that is a change that we'll see as cases come forward. And so the 4 Ps of human trafficking, this is something that is being done at the international level. So prevention, again, awareness and education, as we spoke of, things such as poverty reduction work, demanding or discouraging the demand for labor or services of trafficked persons. Protection, so more safe places to go, more legal information out there so that women and girls and those that are at risk or have been, they know their rights, or they know places they can go, or they can have options for what they can do to try to help themselves. And privacy of the identity of victims. Victims should have that right to have their identity private, because that is also a reason that often they don't want to come forward. They don't feel safe, they feel ashamed. So there are many reasons that they would want their identity to be private. Prosecution, so there needs to be more prosecuting of the offenders. more training of law enforcement and other authorities so that they can identify who these offenders are and protect the rights of those victims. Partnerships, so working together to be able to try to reach and meet these goals of protection, prevention, and prosecution. And so different fields coming together, social, legal, education, health, working together in order to try to prevent, protect, and prosecute us. And so the Canadian Women's Foundation, they developed a hand gesture, which we've been trying to share within the community and with those we work with survivors, victims. It's called a signal for help, and it's a silent signal. If you go to the next slide, you will see the signal. And so a palm to the camera and tuck thumb, trap your thumb underneath. So let's say somebody is on video, on camera, online, or through phone, or let's say they're in a room somewhere and someone comes across that this is now becoming an international sign. And it has been found to be used successfully to get the attention of law enforcement and authorities so that this can become a reported incident, and then the law enforcement and authorities can attend to those places and try to find those that are experiencing the violence at that time. Lastly, what can you do if you yourself is being trafficked and exploited, like the signal that we just showed? First and foremost, with the women and girls, they need to get to a place of safety and away from that situation. They should talk to someone that they trust, such as an adult, an elder, a teacher, a service provider, a friend. Try to attend some of the programs and services that are offered out there to seek help, and to work on realizing their self-worth, practicing self-love and nurture. Work on getting rid of the shame, the guilt, and the humiliation that they may feel, and to have open and safe discussions with other victims and survivors so that those can realize that they're not alone and they can share their story.
So what is it that a person can do if they're being trafficked or exploited in Manitoba? As previously mentioned, Manitoba has created their own laws to deal with human trafficking and exploitation. This includes the Child Sexual Exploitation and Human Trafficking Act. So under this act, an adult or a child who is at risk of or being trafficked can apply for a protection order to keep the people away from them who are trying to traffic and or exploit them. The process to apply is quick, easy, and inexpensive. It's an ex parte process, which means that the traffickers are not told that the order is being applied for until the order is granted and served on the trafficker. Moving on to the next slide here. The following people can apply for one of these protection orders: an adult victim of human trafficking, a parent or guardian of a child victim of human trafficking or child sexual exploitation, a CFS agency, the appropriate CFS authority, or the Director of Child and Family Services, should the child be in care. The following information is provided in order to get the protection order. Human trafficking or child sexual exploitation has occurred. There is a belief that it will continue and that the victim needs protection. It seems to be a fairly low hurdle, but at the same time, there might be some reluctance on the part of these victims to come forward with this. These protection orders are meant to stop the following things from happening. It's from the trafficker from following the victim or other persons, to stop the trafficker from connecting or communicating with the victim or other persons, whether they contact the victim directly or indirectly. Meant to stop the trafficker from going near or into any place that the victim or other persons go to regularly, for example, their work, school, or home. And also meant to stop the trafficker from being able to keep the victim's things, pictures, or documents. So in the Ontario context, Ontario has also created laws to deal with human trafficking and exploitation. This includes the Anti-Human Trafficking Act of 2017. This law allows people who are being trafficked or at risk of being trafficked to apply for a restraining order to protect themselves and their children from traffickers. This is an order from the court that will put restrictions on the trafficker's behavior, and the order can last up to 3 years and can be renewed if necessary. So the following people can apply for one of these restraining orders: a victim or survivor of human trafficking, a person with lawful custody of the victim or survivor who is a child, or a person acting on behalf of the victim, or someone who has custody of the child victim. The victim or the person with custody has to give their consent to the application. In Ontario, under this law, some of the factors that are considered include the ages of the victims, survivor, and the respondents, the nature of the relationship between the victims and the respondents, the use of threats or other forms of intimidation, the use of force, use of deception, fraud, or other forms of coercion, whether drugs or alcohol were given to the survivor to make them provide labor or services, control of the victim's access to alcohol or drugs, whether there was control of the victim's or survivor's finances, ID documents, or etc., whether there was keeping, selling, advertising, or distributing explicit photos or videos of the victim/survivor. So under this, in Ontario, the court can make orders such as stopping the trafficker from directly or indirectly communicating with or contacting the victim or any other person specified in the order. I can also stop the trafficker from being within a specified distance of a place where the victim would be. It would force the trafficker to return ID documents. Traffickers to not allow them to carry any weapons. It also stopped traffickers from distributing explicit photos and videos of the victim and returning those photos and videos back to the victim. I think Sen will discuss the resources that are available.
Yes, and then so we wanted to conclude our presentation just providing a list of some of the resources available in Ontario where someone can go for help. We have a few pages of resources in the legal information booklet that we created that are specific to Ontario and Manitoba. And so as I understand, I had said at the beginning that is available on Metric's website. And so if anyone was wanting to see that list of resources, they could go there as well. So is the legal information booklet and the report that I prepared following all of the consultations and interviews that I did. And so I think that concludes our presentation for this afternoon. We want to thank everybody who joined. We really appreciate being able to share this information, as well as have so many people that want to discuss it, learn more, see the importance in this as well. Again, I just want to then thank Metric. I want to thank Steve, and as well as all of those that I worked with on this project. There is our contact information for our law firm. So our email and telephone and fax number, as well as our address out here at Swan Lake First Nation. And so I guess we'll leave it open now for questions.
Thank you so much, Seneca and Steve.